Okay, so hello everyone and welcome today to another episode of SpraynPray1000's The Verdict. I am SpraynPray1000 and today we're going to be talking about Tokyo Mirage Sessions, #FE, or as some people call it, #FE. This is the Shin Megami Tensei X Fire Emblem game that was thrown around for a few years and it finally debuted. And I'm just going to give some of my closing thoughts on this playthrough, so let's just jump right into it. To start, this game is a fairly straightforward turn-based RPG where you control a party of up to 3 people as you fight your way through dungeons, you progress through the story, and in general, just, you know, your typical kind of RPG blend. There's overworlds to visit, there's side quests to do, you level up, you gain the usual stuff, but what makes this game very different is that unlike, you know, your typical RPG where it's a fantasy-style game, where it's fairly straightforward, you know, who does what role and everything. A lot of characters in this game can be customized. The game has very heavy roots in show arts and performances, so a lot of the characters are singers and dancers, and that goes hand in hand with the story, and actors as well. And that plays into a part that, like, each battle is almost sort of a performance done on the stage. It really sets a nice tone for the game. It sets a very unique one, I'd even say. But to start right off, the number one thing that I think the gameplay is really kind of hindered by is the way that the party is set up. The way that the party is set up is that the main character, Itsuki, can never be swapped out. And because of this, you are essentially locked into using him in every single fight. And on top of that, the party size is only 3 people strong. So what ends up happening is that Itsuki might not be the best character for all situations, meaning that because of that, you only really have the flexibility to choose 2 different party members to react to any situation and potentially cover Itsuki. Now, this is kind of balanced out by the fact that, you know, you don't really need healing in this game as much. You can just use items. But it does make some fights rather annoying and tedious, where if you were able to swap out Itsuki for someone who's more suited to the situation, the fights would begin to become a little bit easier, or at least take a little bit less time. And I think that's one of the biggest problems of this game, is that as the game goes on, as you gain more various abilities and everything, and the enemies get stronger and stronger, fights take longer and longer because you're more or less unable to one-shot them. You're not able to really easily, quickly defeat enemies, so fights become more like a time sink at the end of the game rather than something fun. Now, one thing that I did like about this game is the session system. Essentially what a session system is it builds off the whole Shin Megami Tensei style of hitting a weak point on an enemy for bigger damage and knocking them down. Instead of knocking them down in this game, what will happen is that when you trigger a weak point or use a skill that an enemy is weak to on that enemy, your teammates will jump in afterwards and they will combo with your type of ability. So for instance, if you use a fire ability and an enemy's weak to it, maybe one teammate will have the ability to combo your fire move with a sword move, and then another teammate will be able to combo a sword move with a bow skill, and so on and so forth. Of course, the weapons and magic drawing from, you know, Fire Emblem and Shin Megami Tensei, which is cool. I like that system a lot. The problem is, like I said before, the battles in this game tend to drag on greatly towards the end, and because you have to wait for each animation to play out so the damage can be added up, it ends up making fights that would normally be cleared in about 30 seconds to a minute take anywhere from 2 minutes to 3 minutes, depending on how strong they are. And it just adds on extra unnecessary time. So I think the number one thing that could happen is that they could certainly have fast-forwarded through a lot of it, allowed you to fast-forward through it, allowed you to skip it maybe, just add up the damage, or, you know what I mean, like that sort of thing. I like the system, but, you know, that in and of itself is a little bit awkward and weird. Compounded by the fact that, again, some of the fights, you know, you're locked into characters that you don't necessarily have, or that aren't necessarily the best for the situation. That also sort of plays into a role and plays an effect on that. Otherwise, the game itself is not that difficult, which is not a bad thing. You know, I'm not like saying that this game is, you know, super ridiculously hard. It's just that there will be times when you could be potentially screwed, and I did experience that a few times, whether I was grinding or in the playthrough, where I was fighting enemies, and because I went in with the wrong setup, or the wrong party setup, or the wrong initial couple of moves, I was basically screwed over, and the fight took a lot longer because I had to work around that, or just flat out start over. Now, on the flip side, I do like the fact that they have a variety of abilities. You can customize each character into various different ways. And, you know, that might seem a staple of RPGs, but I really feel like towards the end of the game, I had a couple of really good characters, and I could freely swap out between at least 5 of them at any given point. There are, you know, one character who's not Itsuki I feel is a little bit weak overall, but the rest of them I feel are reasonably usable in almost every aspect. They all have various abilities that help them do whatever job they have, and I really enjoyed, you know, sort of figuring out what roles were the best and allowing my characters to hit what they need to. Unlike most RPGs where I feel like towards the end of the game, you know, I might have just the standard party full of decent characters, and that's about it. This one I definitely had enough to really kind of freely swap in and out. But let's keep moving on. Let's talk about the story. The story of this game is basically, the main character is called Itsuki, and he joins this organization called Fortuna Entertainment, which specializes in singing and actors and all sorts of performing arts, and it's generally to put them forward, but at the same time they are fighting against an organization of evil entities from another world called Mirages, and essentially Mirages steal performa from humans. Humans, of course, having the ability to naturally generate performa because they create, you know, song and dance and performing arts. And that's, again, where the game gets its whole tone of being a, you know, a show star, being an idol, being an actor for all the different characters. And a lot of the side stories really reflect that. And even some of the early aspects of the game also reflect that in Tsubasa's evolution from just being a shy sort of side character into being a full-on idol, into being a full-on actor, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem that I have with the story, the main overall story, not the side stories, is that the game's story more or less takes a massive dip and change after the end of Chapter 4. Basically, the first half, or well, it's more like the first 2/3 of this story feels more like a Tsubasa story. It's meant to really show her evolution and growth as a character. Meanwhile, the last 2 chapters of this game more or less end up being save the world type of stuff. And while it was slightly alluded to in the beginning of the game and early parts of the game, it doesn't really blend very well with the narrative that they started writing out to begin with, to the point that it almost feels like 2 entirely different stories altogether. And while the game is reasonably long, you know, it doesn't really blend well. So if I could give an example, like Tales of Symphonia's story really blends well when you know, when the big plot twists occur and stuff changes, because it feels like the whole game has been building up towards this natural progression and natural shifting of the narrative. Meanwhile, the paradigm shift in Tokyo Mirage is a little bit harder. It's a little bit, well, I wouldn't say a little bit, it's pretty hard. It's pretty abrupt. It almost kind of ignores most of the stuff that you built up towards at the start of the game, more or less because Tsubasa begins to take more and more of a backseat role, and you begin to get the more typical JRPG style narrative. Now, the story is enjoyable. I won't say that like, oh, well, you shouldn't play through to the end, because the ending is pretty satisfying. The only problem is that there's a few things about the story that are very cliche, and this also extends to the side stories. Very straightforward, generic type of stuff. It would have been interesting to see a few more plot twists in there. Side stories tend to be a little bit repetitive. You know, some of the stuff is just a little bit weird. But whatever. I mean, you know, you can more or less roll with it. If you're playing this game, I'm assuming more or less you're able to tolerate it, or at least you're willing to skip it and just get back to the gameplay. But it's not horrible. It's just not ridiculously innovative is the term I'll use. It's your typical kind of RPG side story. So yeah, for the most part, there's that. The other problem is that I feel like a lot of the characters, some of the characters are really well written, are very interesting, are very well fleshed out characters, and that, you know, their conversations with their Mirages really kind of reflect that. But on the flip side of that, some of the characters are very paper thin, very stereotypical, just, you know, very comic reliefy. And while I'm glad that they gave them, you know, equal attention, that, you know, they weren't just cardboard cutouts and then you forget about them, at the same time, I feel like they could have been evolved more. Specifically, the main character, Tsubasa, and a couple other ones, the big weeaboo guitarist and whatnot. could have been a little more fleshed out. But at the end of the story, I felt that a lot of these characters, despite their flaws, I could really connect with them. I could really see how this game was good and interesting, and the story is worthwhile and interesting enough to keep me playing. The combat being innovative, but at the same time a little bit flawed and slow. The story, on the other side, being interesting but kind of divisive, bipolar, excuse me, and just, you know, all over the place at some points. This game kind of shapes up to be just above average, but not by a ridiculous amount. Now, what saves it, I would say, besides the gameplay, is the way this game looks. The presentation of this game, the characters, the scenery, the environments, really bring this game to life. It feels like this game has a very upbeat, installed sort of atmosphere. This game knows what it wants to be, and that's the thing I said about this game at numerous points, that despite its flaws, there's slivers of really good greatness here. There's slivers of amazingness in this game, and while it does grab some of them, maybe not wholly, but at the same time, they could be done better in a lot of different places. But I enjoyed the environments. I enjoyed a couple things. I wish a few things could be more clear, such as side quest direction. The music, of course, is fantastic. I just want to say that. The cutscenes are well done. The special things you get for doing the side stories and sitting through them are pretty good. There's a lot of good animation in this game, which is why I really like it. I don't know how many people remember me playing some of the Sword Art games, or, well, I think I've only played one Sword Art game for my channel. Yeah, I think I did. I only played one. I only played Lost Song. Sort of like that. You know, I like this whole anime art style that they do with cell shading and whatnot. It really does a good job, and definitely here, this game's presentation in that format is really just stellar and out the park. But ultimately, I gotta really just say, what would I give Tokyo Mirage Sessions? Now, I know I listed some things that kind of take off a lot of points, but overall, I feel like this game was a beneficial experience. That this game, I would feel a little bit worse if I didn't play a lot of it. So I'm going to give it a positive review. I'm going to give it a good one, because I feel that as a good, strong RPG, you know, I would give this, you know, the kind of attention I would give a Tales game. In fact, I'm going to rate it similarly to what I rated, you know, Tales of Zestiria. I'm going to give it an 83 out of 100. Like I said, the story could have been polished up a bit better. A lot of the dialogue and stuff could have been, you know, reworked, cut out, made a little more streamlined. You know, just the game in general, the story as well could have been a little more streamlined. If, you know, maybe a few more dungeons here or there, and just maybe a little bit more story evolution. The gameplay could be, you know, altered a bit, sped up, maybe have you do more damage. You know, a lot of times the battles draw on. A lot of times enemies just feel like they have too much health. But ultimately, there wasn't anything too upsetting to the point that I really feel like I could not overcome it, I could not beat it, and that the experience overall was a negative. So in that regard, Tokyo Mirage gets a thumbs up for me. And I expected, you know, I didn't expect it to be this good. So this hits about right on the money. Like I said with Zestiria a long time ago, I mean, I expected that to be better, but, you know, it's satisfactory when it's good. When at its worst, it's just tedious. It's not unplayable. It's not, you know, flow killing. It's just tedious. So that's what I'm going to give Tokyo Mirage. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you next time for another verdict. I am SpraynPray1000.